Hello, and welcome to the SMU Video Archive series. In this series, we interview members of the SMU community who can provide insight into the history of the university, especially from the perspective of their time here. I'm Jim Brooks, and today we have with us Bobby Lyle. Bobby, you've had a long and multifaceted association with the university, and I seem to remember from our dim, distant past associations that you're an engineer by original undergraduate background, and you used to work at the old Geotechnical Corporation, then a part of Teledyne.
Correct. That's correct.
And then you pick up the story and talk about when you first came to the university and in what role, and we'll chat about all that.
Jim, your memory is good. I was working at Geotech, which, as you mentioned, later became a Teledyne Industries subsidiary, and was going to graduate school at SMU in the engineering school. I had hoped to, after an undergraduate degree in engineering, hoped to get an MBA, but Geotech would not pay for an MBA, but they would pay for an engineering master's degree, so I enrolled at SMU in the engineering administration program. And while I was in that program, starting out part-time, and then decided to take a leave from Geotech and to go to school full-time, I started taking courses in the business school. And at that time, the head of the management department in the business school was a man named Al Baker. And he had managed to obtain what I believe was the first funded research grant in the history of the business school from the post office department. And I happened to be in one of his classes, and he asked if I would help him with his research project. One thing led to another, and I did that and started helping him teach his courses in quantitative methods of management and supervision, and work with Al throughout that year that I was on campus full-time. And at the end of that year, was asked if I would stay for a year to help him get another research grant from the post office department. And I recall very clearly the conversation because I wanted to go back into business, wanted to get back into industry, and I'd been off for a year and was making student wages, and I needed to make more money. And he said, well, suppose that we can put together a package that would compete with industry. And I didn't know exactly what he had in mind, but through the combination of regular teaching schedules, research grant assistance, teaching at night, and doing everything that I possibly could, a package was put together, and I decided to stay for a year. That year stretched into 8, and as you know, I during that period held a number of positions within the business school.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about that, because I think you and I first became acquainted when you were an assistant dean in the business school, and I was dean of the then School of Humanities and Sciences. And we had some things that we did together and became acquainted. But Jack Grayson had come as dean of the business school during that general period of time, the late 60s, as I recall. And you worked with Jack as one of his assistant deans. And that was a very interesting period in the history of both the business school and the university. And I'd like you to talk a little bit about that, because there were, what for a relatively quiet college about to become a real university, there were some rather earth-shaking changes that went on in the business school in that period of time. And to the extent that you're comfortable doing so, I would be interested in your reflecting on them.
Jim, when Jack was recruited in 1968, and he came after a distinguished career at Tulane University, where he'd been dean of the Graduate School of Business. Jack was a Harvard DBA and came with great credentials. He succeeded Aaron Sarton, who had been the dean of the school during an interim period. And when Jack came in, he came with great expectations about what could be done in business education. And you have to put that period in context of what was going on nationwide in terms of business education, because save and except for some of the real notable graduate business schools such as Harvard and Wharton and Chicago, business schools, particularly in our part of the country, were not terribly well respected as centers of excellence within universities. And Jack came with the thought in mind that that ought to be changed. And I had the opportunity to be in the school for a year before he got here. And for the very first time in my life had seen what a university was like from the faculty administrative side rather than from a student side, and felt that what he was saying he wanted to do was desperately needed in business schools. And I went to see him and asked him if he was serious about making these changes and making these kinds of improvements. And he said, "Oh, yes." And I said, "Well, you're going to need a lot of help." And he said, "Well, wonderful. Why don't you come help me?" And he invited me to be the assistant to the dean and to be in charge of recruiting MBA students. And the thrust was to build an outstanding graduate school of business at SMU to combine with what was a fairly nice-sized undergraduate school. But the graduate full-time program at SMU at that time consisted of 35 students. So I agreed to do that and started a program of going around the country recruiting MBA students into the full-time program. Recruited the first African-American students into the full-time program. And we began to make some what would have been thought of not only at SMU but in other universities around the country, some fairly radical changes in the way that the program was run. And probably most notable was that we went from a 2-year program to 9-month sessions for full-time MBA students separated by a summer break, to a 1-year program that was intended to run for 12 full months, to be an intensive program, and to enable a student to come in, register in August, and graduate the next July or the next August. And this was a radical departure at the time from what was happening, because programs had historically followed the Harvard Business School model of being a 2-year program. The faculty got on board. Jack was a very charismatic leader, probably one of the most creative persons I've ever known. But he was an out-of-the-box thinker, and he would stretch your imagination. He stretched some imaginations to the limit, I think, from time to time. And he began to bring in, from around the country, young faculty members who really were out on the frontier of what was happening in business and management education, and heavy focus on organizational behavior and administration, in addition to the more fundamental classic areas such as finance and accounting. And this was a significant change. Jack also tested the university outside of just the business school, because his thoughts were viewed as certainly being progressive, and in some cases maybe even on the radical side. But one of the things that Jack was able to do was to excite the business community about building at SMU and in the city of Dallas a world-class school. And the business community recognized the need for that within the city of Dallas if Dallas was to grow and prosper. and got behind that in a significant way. And he was able to garner the support of the corporate leadership in Dallas in a way that the school had never had. And of course that was attractive to the university because that meant that there was the potential for additional financial support, not only for the business school, but that would spill over into other parts of the university. And so we commenced that process in 1968. It was interesting that the ideas, which were somewhat controversial from time to time, were being totally embraced by the students. The student body was very excited about what we were doing, perhaps more so from time to time than the faculty was. And I'm sure that we tested the provost and we tested the president, but we were fortunate to have people like Willis Tate and Neil McFarland and ultimately Jim Brooks, who would give us the support to try to go and do what we thought needed to be done. So in 1968 started, and we hit a plateau here that I want to share with you, but you may have another question you want to ask.
No, I was just going to comment. You had referred briefly to recruiting interesting faculty. I remember very well one young man named Canavan, whose approach to everything, as far as the outside world could see, was unique. But people like that are yeasty.
They are yeasty, and Pat Canavan, who came out of Yale University, was extremely bright. Pat had some avant-garde ideas, to say the least. Pat, in his first year here, when he arrived on campus, he took his door off his office and hung ties to separate him from the hallway, neckties down to provide at least a little visual barrier, and took most of the furniture out and put beanbag chairs in. And of course the students, as you can well imagine, loved him. They just thought this guy was wonderful. And of course Pat was young. He was not much older than our graduate students, but he was also very bright, very thought-provoking. And Pat was one of the young leaders, young Turks that in a sense that Jack brought in to really not just shake things up, but to move things forward. I remember the first year that Pat was here, and we, as a part of the orientation program, inflated a huge bubble on the lawn of the business school that also brought a great deal of attention to the school, and the students were flocking there, and it was a way to attract people to say, we're here, we're open for business. And the business school is going to be different, and it's a place that welcomes undergraduate and graduate students. Come find out what we're doing. And that was kind of the feel of the school during that period.
Well, you know, one of the first real contacts that I had with the school after I became provost, you and Jack were nice enough to invite me to one of your Saturday events, which were known euphemistically as the Jack and Bobby shows. And that was a very interesting exercise for me in university leadership. Different than anything I'd ever run into before, but very effective. You did quite a few of those, didn't you?
We did, and we did that not only for other members of the university community outside the business school, and you were kind enough to come, and you're generous and gracious in your comments about that, but we also invited people out of the business community. And we took some risk because we were doing some things with them, in some cases that were very different, and we were inviting them to see what we were doing, to experience what we were doing. And it went over well. I mean, it was not without a little tension, but it went over well, and people liked being included. And it began to cement relationships with people like Ed Cox, after whom the school subsequently became named, Bill Clements, Ray Hunt, Herman Lay, and Bobby Stewart, and other business leaders really got behind what we were doing. And in some cases, I think we found them pulling as well as pushing. So they were really challenging us to be the best we could and not to be afraid to do things differently if that's what was required.
Yeah. And that in those sessions that I attended, that was certainly manifestly clear that this was cutting edge kind of stuff in terms of the way universities at that period in time ran themselves. Well, now, moving on, in the Nixon administration, Jack went on to become Price Administrator, and you became Executive Dean of the business school. And you and I worked very closely in that period of time, and it was a very interesting period. And what I'd like you to do is to reflect a little bit on the other deans with whom you related, because that was a very interesting cast of characters that I had the pleasure of presiding over in weekly Council of Deans meetings. And I'd be interested in any thoughts you might have about that, because that was a very important piece of the university history of that period of the 60s and 70s.
It truly was. And there's an interesting thing that happened, Jim, just before that I think is worthy of note, if I may. And that is that as we were moving from 1968 to 1970, it became very clear that if the school was to achieve what Jack had hoped that it would, what Willis had hoped that it would, what the business community did, that we needed to get very serious about planning a way to do that. That in addition to the leadership, we needed a management program that would take this, an administrative program to take the school where it needed to go. And so we started that process, and to our surprise and to our delight, Ross Perot came to us and offered to give us a planning grant that we would spend 6 months in planning to make the SMU Business School the best graduate business school at that time. He characterized it as the best in the Southwest. And we accepted that gift. He gave a similar gift to Texas A&M and to North Texas State and to TCU. And there was a bit of competition that followed. And Jack and I then mobilized the resources of our faculty, literally went all over the United States talking to CEOs, to other educators outside the United States, to some foreign countries, with talking to schools that were doing outstanding things, to put together what we believe to be the way for us to take the SMU Business School from where it was to one of national prominence. And after that 6-month period, Mr. Perot had said that he would consider aggressively funding the school that he thought had the best plan. In September of that year, 1970, we presented that plan to the Perot Foundation and asked for $12.1 million. It turned out that the Perot Foundation did not fund any of the 4 schools, but it was my opinion then, it still is, that was the thing that really turned the corner for the business school, that opportunity to spend a concentrated period in strategic planning. What happened next was that Jack was, in fact, invited to go to Washington to be chairman of the Price Commission, and left and was gone. We thought he'd be gone about 6 months. It turned out he was gone from 1970 until 1973. And I had the opportunity during that period to serve as the acting dean of the school and to work, of course, closely with you during that period and these other interesting deans of the other schools. And it was truly an interesting period in the university's history. We had some real characters as deans, all of whom were skilled, talented administrators in their own right, all of whom were struggling with that period in the university's history where it was ready to break out and grow, and there were ideas that cost more than the university could afford to spend, and so we always had to bring those to your table to say, Jim, help us divide up this pie. And the business school found itself in a situation where it had become a popular school. It was a relatively cost-efficient school, and therefore it was generating surplus revenue over its cost. And there were always those tensions that arose between the schools that were running deficits, the schools that were running surpluses. And it was an exciting and challenging time, I know, for you as provost, and certainly for us as deans.
Yeah. Well, that was certainly was an interesting period, and even though there were certainly controversies that I had with every one of you, I'm pleased to say that every one of you emerged at the end of that period as a good friend.
Absolutely.
Well, let's move on and talk. You stayed then until you decided to go away and do your doctorate.
That's correct. I had Jack came back to SMU in 1973.
That's right.
And I took a position at that point as the executive dean of the school to take the responsibility for the internal work, and Jack took the deanship title back and was mainly responsible for raising money for the school and providing the overall leadership. I had decided that by the time I was 35 years old that I wanted to make an election to either go back into business, go into industry, stay in a university, or I'd had the opportunity with Jack after he came back to go back to Washington with him and work in the White House for a little while, and had a little bit of taste of what that might be like. And so I was looking at career paths and thought that if I wanted to stay in a university, I needed to go finish work on a doctorate, which I had started at the University of Massachusetts, working with a man that subsequently has become very famous, a man named Ken Blanchard, who is now a well-known consultant and writer. But Ken was my doctoral dissertation chairman, and to work on a dissertation in strategic planning and leadership in higher education. And told Jack that I wanted to do that, and he was supportive of it. I went and talked to Willis Tate, who was at that time the president/chancellor, and told Willis I wanted to do that, and he said, fine, you can't resign. We'll give you a leave of absence, but you can't resign because you need a home. He was such a wonderful, wonderful father figure in a way to so many of us, but a wonderful president and compassionate president. And so I took a leave of absence and went to UMass to finish a year of residency and to write a doctoral dissertation. And did that a wonderful year. It was 1976. It was the bicentennial, and it was wonderful to be in New England during that period. Didn't like being away from Texas and didn't like being away from SMU, but it was a wonderful experience.
Yeah. Well then, at that point in time, Alan Coleman took your place, working with Jack, and ultimately Alan became dean of the business school when Jack resigned to go on to Houston and do other things.
He did. We had recruited, in fact, I had hired Alan to be a finance professor. He had been away from Stanford. He had been out in business, and we hired him to come and be a finance professor. When I left, he became the executive dean and subsequently became the dean of the business school. And very different personality, very different style, very different approach to business education than Jack had had, or that I had for that matter. But Alan began to move the school in a slightly different direction. Not saying it was better or worse, it was different.
Well, I think as I've reflected on it, what you and Jack did was really to break an old pattern and set a whole new paradigm for business education, and Alan then came along and built on that, and as is inevitable in those situations, there are changes of direction.
Absolutely. Jim, it was interesting during that period, talking about breaking with tradition. After we went to a one-year program, there were a number of one-year programs that emerged around the country and followed the pattern. It was also interesting that during that period, we had a group of people called the dissonant deans of business schools, and it consisted of Larry Foraker, who was dean of the Harvard Business School, Don Carroll, who was the dean at Wharton. We had the dean at NYU, the dean at Tulane, the dean at Duke, the Igor Ansoff, who was the new dean at Vanderbilt. They had just started a new business school, and Jack and myself. And this group would meet every quarter of the year to talk about what we were doing in those schools. I mean, it was a top-notch group of people,
Yeah,
and
you were in good company.
we were in good company. And so one of the things that it said was we've been accepted.
Yeah.
And I think we'd been accepted not just because we were doing things differently, but that we were doing things that were exciting and needed to be done to break the mold of business education. Not everybody needed to do it exactly the same way, but this group would get together to talk about what was new, what was different, and it was a wonderful way to share and to bring ideas back to SMU that we could put in place here. And they were doing the same thing.
Exactly.
And they kind of looked at us, frankly, as the ones to try new ideas. They'd push. They'd say, we can't do that at Harvard. You all go do that. So it was kind of a fun period.
Well, I didn't know about that group, but that is very good company to be in, and it's a compliment to what you and Jack were attempting to do here, and we're doing actually, that the others affiliated with you effectively. Well, let's move on because then you were out of the inside of the university family, if I can put it that way, to use Willis's frequently used metaphor of the university as family. But shortly you came back as a trustee of the university, and you were a trustee for 18 years, and during what had to be one of the most difficult periods in the university's history. And I'd like you to talk a little bit about those years as you saw them as a trustee, because you were a key member of the board during much of that time.
To characterize it as an interesting and difficult period is maybe is an understatement. It was a time of great stress for the university, all members of the university family, trustees, students, president, faculty members. I had been fortunate when I finished my work at UMass. I decided to come back to Dallas and to get in the oil business. And Alan Coleman approached me and asked if I would come back into the business school and chair an organization that I had started with Ray Hunt and I had started in 1970 called the Associate Board. And I agreed to do that. And that was my first real re-entry back into the university. And subsequent to that, I was asked to go on the board and indeed was there during that important transition period, because when I went on the board probably had 80 plus members. It had a very active board of governors in addition to the board of trustees. The board of governors was much smaller and really acted as the executive committee, if you will, of the board of trustees, and was most directly engaged with the running of the university. The board meetings were ceremonial, they were large, they were difficult to deal with. The issue with the football team occurred, and it's of course well publicized what happened during that period with regard to the penalties that were imposed upon the university, the assertions that certain persons knew about what was going on, and it caused the university to look at itself from a governance standpoint in ways that perhaps it never had. And that resulted, as you are well aware, in a significant, almost complete change in the way the university was governed, going from a very large board of trustees to one that was relatively small of about 42 people, and with a major change in personalities and personnel on the board. I think that I'm correct that there were maybe six to eight of us who made that transition from the old board to the new board, a relatively small group. And then around that core, built back up to a board of 42, and a board that really looked to the Board of Trustees for leadership, did away with the Board of Governors. We did have and do have an executive committee of the board, but it has very specific and limited responsibilities. The Board of Trustees really is the policy-making group, and went to great lengths to examine the governance of the university at that time, to look at the inclusive nature of that, or at that time the exclusive nature of it, to be sure that we included students, to be sure we included faculty members. I had the unusual privilege of being the president of the Alumni Association the year that it was determined that the president of the Alumni Association would be on the Board of Trustees. I was pulling double duty because I was a trustee also, but I was the first president of the Alumni Association to serve in that capacity. But now you have those members of different constituencies on the board in addition to just those that might have been there in that prior history. It was a period of great reflection as to how we were running the university. It was a period of trauma. It was a period of fear as to not knowing exactly what the repercussions of this was going to be, how long it was going to take to recover. But it was a period of great commitment on the part of those of us like the Jim Brookses of the university and the Ray Hunts and the Bob Dedmans and who loved this university to the point that we were committed not to let this stop us, not to let it get us down, to learn from it, but to move forward as quickly as we could to rebuild the confidence of the community in who we were, what we were, rebuild the confidence of the academic world in who we were and what we were, of parents, of students, of faculty members, and to pull this together, to use this trauma, if you will, as a way to galvanize the support of the university in ways that we'd never known it before, and to be able to build on that.
Yeah, that it seemed to me that as I watched from a perspective more inside the university than out, that perhaps this was one of the 2 or 3 most important things that had happened in the life of the university over now almost 100 years. Right. Because we had drifted into governance patterns that would allow things like the football scandal to happen, and they were nobody's fault in particular. That was following a series of external events in the late 50s, early 60s that set up the Board of Governors pattern, and it worked well for a while. But very clearly we needed a smaller Board of Trustees that would really take the responsibility and feel that responsibility and bring commitment and experience to the table. And it seems to me that in what was certainly a very dark and dismal period for all of us, a very good thing came out of it, which was the reconstitution of the board as an active, growing board.
Exactly. I think it did another thing, and that is that I think it helped to reestablish and in some ways to redefine the role of the Methodist Church in SMU. I think that there had been a drifting apart of the Methodist Church and the university, and part of that was just de facto, just happened, yeah. And part of it was perhaps even by design. But what this did was, when that event occurred, the church stepped forward and played a positive role in redefining the governance of the university and in becoming a more active and constructive part of the future of the university. And I think that was an outcome that perhaps was unexpected, but it happened, and I think it's been good.
Yes, I agree with you. Well, let's move on, unless there are other items of trusteeship that you particularly want to talk about. But let me in thinking about our conversation this morning, it occurred to me that you and I have had the opportunity to be associated with a fair number of the presidents of this institution, and as I count up, you've been associated one way or another with 6 of them, And any thoughts, comments, reflections you have on them and the role they played in shaping the university, I think would be very interesting.
Jim, I think about that frequently, as a matter of fact. It's hard for me to set foot on campus and not reflect a little bit on that. Being here as a student and a faculty member and an administrator and a trustee and over that long period of time. And one of the things that I've observed with our presidents is that somewhat amazes me is how they seem to fit the time. When I first arrived and Willis was the president, Willis, of course, was a huge man. Physically, he was a huge man, and he looked like a university president. At least that's what I thought a university president ought to look like. And he had the personality and the compassion of a warm, considerate leader. And Willis was inspirational, and Willis was good for the time. When Willis decided to step aside and to bring in a new president, as they came one behind the other, from Paul Hardin to Jim Zumberg to Don Shields and to Ken Pye and now to Gerald Turner. As we went through all of the presidents and some interim presidents, as a matter of fact, like Jim Kirby, they all fill the shoes quite well given the demands of that time. Probably the most notable among those was after the debacle with the football program, when Ken Pye was recruited. And looking back at that time, I can think of no one that could have filled that role better than Ken did. He was tough. He had a steel-trap mind. He could remember figures from when he was 2 years old, I'm sure. And very seldom did he make a factual mistake. Ken had a personality that did not warm to some folks, and he was viewed at times as being cold and calculating and always businesslike. He really had a side to him that was fun, and I've seen that side. I've sat on a porch with him in front of his house on a Saturday morning with him in a sweatsuit and had a lot of fun with him, talking about things as they were and as we would hope they would be. But Ken was perfect, in my opinion, for the situation that the university found itself in. And I can say without any qualification that Gerald Turner has been absolutely perfect for the university given the time that we're in. I'm not sure that Ken Pye could have done what Gerald has done. And I'm not sure that Gerald could have done what Ken Pye did. They're very different in personality, in background and skills and experience, but they were good, and I think, without too much of a stretch, may have even been perfect for the university for that time. I didn't work with Jim Zumberg, didn't know him very well. I knew him by reputation, and that was a short tenure. But I think that for that brief period of time, as far as I know, Jim did an adequate job. But the ones that I have worked with most closely being Willis and Paul Hardin and Don Shields, Ken Pye and Jim Kirby, and now Gerald Turner, I've just been amazed at how they seem to fit the situation that's there. And we've been very fortunate to have that kind of leadership.
Well, I concur with you, having worked with the same 6 presidents and in varying degrees as you have. Where do you see, you've come off of the Board of Trustees, but you have a perspective that is almost unique given your roles inside the university and then in the Board of Trustees. How do you see the next 5, 10 years unrolling for the university?
Well, I'm excited about the next 5 to 10 years. I think that the last 4 to 5 years have been remarkable, absolutely remarkable. When you and I were working together in those early years, I can remember that we had $33 million of endowment.
That's right.
Who would have thought that within a relatively short period of time and ahead of schedule that the university would have been able to raise $450 million in a capital campaign? And we were fortunate in that we hit that campaign at the right time. The economy was right, the leadership was right in the university and the board of trustees with Ray and Hunt and Bob Dedman and Karen Prothrow and Ruth Alschuler and W.R. Howell. It worked out to be a wonderful coming together of talent and the economy to put that in place. As we know, most of those monies, or a large portion of those monies, have gone toward building facilities. What I'm excited about in the next 5 to 10 years is coming on the heels of that with maybe a chance to catch our breath, and maybe the economy and the unfortunate events, the event that occurred on September the 11th may have caused us all to rethink a little bit and adjust what we think the future may be. But I'm excited about moving beyond the bricks and mortar now to a major undertaking of funding for programs for each of the schools, for scholarships, for faculty enhancements, whether those be in the form of higher salaries and benefits and research opportunities and writing opportunities for faculty, but to move to the softer side, if you will, of the fundraising for programmatic needs rather than brick and mortar needs. I know the president is committed to that, and I think once we catch our breath, it's going to be fun to get back in it, building off the successes that we've had here over the last few years. I really think that over the next 5 years, we're likely to see more cooperation within the university than we have even in the past. And I know you've been involved in a number of programs, Jim, as provost, on the faculty, as dean, and even after retirement. I think you probably brought retirement to an art form. You've retired so many times, but that you have been an advocate of programs that bring different schools together and under some umbrella. And I think that Ross Murfin is doing much of the same thing in his capacity as provost. And I think through things like the McGuire Ethics Center, through the Institute for the Study of Earth and Man, through the Hart Global Leaders Forum, programs like that are going to be university-wide and bring people together to share resources across schools and bring our student body together as well as our faculty together is something that I see happening with greater frequency in the next 5 to 10 years, and I'm excited about that. I think it's going to be tremendous.
What kind of reading do you get in your crystal ball about the makeup of the student body in that period of time? This is something that you have not rehearsed, but with me, and nor have you rehearsed any of it with me, as a matter of fact. But it's one that may be a little less something that you're less thinking about regularly than some of the items that we've just covered.
Well, I think that at the foundation for SMU, as it has been historically, the foundation will continue to be a very, very strong undergraduate program in each of the degree granting schools. And I don't see that changing. And I think that we're getting better and better and better at differentiating ourselves from public institutions. We've only been working at this for 100 years, and we're going to get it right sooner or later, but we're getting better at that. And I think that we will attract a more diverse student body than we've had in the past. And I think that will be both economic diversity, ethnicity. I think we're going to have continue to have a growing number of foreign nationals who will be in our undergraduate program. And I think we're going to work at that as a university, and I think that will make for a better undergraduate student body as we grow over the next several years. I think that with the opportunity that we have with a new engineering school dean to really emphasize that program, we're going to see that school come on strong. But I think with the improvements that are being made in each of our degree granting schools, given the success of this capital campaign and the one that I think is going to come on the heels of it, we're going to see a student body that's just going to be, I think, is going to be exemplary over the next 5 to 10 years.
But probably a student body of about the same size that we've had for the last 30 years.
Oh, yeah. I think that it's not going to be that much greater. We may make some additional efforts to do things like SMU at Legacy and some satellite campusing type of activities, and maybe through the use of the electronic opportunities that we have to do some things off-site. But in terms of an on-site campus, we're kind of locked in. We're landlocked in a sense, and we can't get much bigger. And I'm not sure we'd want to get much bigger. I think the size is probably about where we'd want it to be.
Yeah. Well, Bobby, it's been a pleasure to visit with you. Are there any other items that you would like to cover for posterity before we quit?
Jim, I really don't think so. I think you've asked me the kinds of questions that have given me the opportunity to reflect on that period. I will say that I've never, ever been more optimistic about the university than I am right now. And it's fun to talk about the history. It's also fun to put that history in perspective and use it as a foundation to build on for the future, and that's what I'm excited about. The last 100 years are great. The last 32 years that I've been associated with the university have been fun, but I'm interested in the next 32 years and what happens from this point forward, and who is the next Jim Brooks to sit in that provost role and provide leadership for us.
Well, clearly you're very optimistic, and so am I about what lies ahead for this place. And when people invest large pieces of themselves in an organization, it's good that they can have a feeling like that of real optimism about what lies ahead. We thank you very much, Bobby.
Jim,
it's
thank
been
you.
a real pleasure.
Listen, it's my pleasure. Thank you very much.